Hey guys, welcome to the Hypertrophy Hub podcast. This week I'm speaking to the lovely Jacob Schepis. So we're going to be speaking about a range of things throughout this conversation, but primarily sort of hypertrophy programming. The sort of opening question I sort of wanted to start with Jacob today is, I think Jacob's done a really good job of, he's probably been one of the main drivers of my sort of method of hypertrophy programming, if that's how you'd phrase it. I think he does a good job of synthesizing all the information in the industry, because there's a lot, and there's a lot of conflicting opinions, pretty much at all times, not just at the controversial times that are quite obvious, but I think across the board. And I think Jacob's done quite a good job of synthesizing it in a way that is, I guess you would say, evidence-based, and I would say the purest manner, because it's I think merging practice with evidence quite well. Like, for example, one of the things that I like that you've done and you sort of opened my eyes to was the sort of that article not an article, the infographic you put on JPS, where it was sort of the differing RIR per sort of the how sort of highly compounded a movement is versus isolation, et cetera, et cetera. So things like that I found were quite sort of eye-opening, because there's less sort of black and white thinking of applying that and all those kinds of things. But in terms of all this, Jacob, how do you go about navigating the sort of landscape of hypertrophy information? Because as someone who, like, if you're a beginner and you don't understand this stuff to a massive degree, and then say you understand the principles, once you learn what volume means and what intensity means and all that, how do you go about kind of finding your quote unquote method, or finding the way that you can program for someone, or actually tying these things together when there's so much like conflicting information relatively, I guess, within hypertrophy training?
Yeah, so obviously that's a very loaded question, and one that's not easy to answer. But I guess when you're trying to understand any topic, especially something like an applied science such as resistance training, you need to know what information is obviously good information, sound, accurate, and then how relevant that information is in practice to you, or the specific niche and demographic that you're trying to apply that information to, and also when it's relevant, and to what degree. Now, trying to elucidate good and bad information is obviously quite a challenging task, and one that I think takes a lot of people many, many years to become confident at. Is to have that critical eye, and to be able to discern which information is more likely to be true, or at least closer to the truth than other information. And also, it's funny how the degree of truth in any information is not only dependent on the time that it's said, because obviously information changes over time, but also to what specific situation and all the sort of potential context that you're taking that information from and trying to map it onto. Because that's what we're doing in an applied science. We have somebody who's lifting weights, they're in the gym, they have their own unique context, their training history, their background, their nutritional status, body composition, genetics, injury history, all those sorts of things. We're taking a piece of information and trying to apply it to them. Say, for example, an information such as the recommendations for hypertrophy that we sort of extrapolate from the literature, that is to train with, anywhere from 8 or more sets per week per muscle group, thereabouts. And we want to train, pretty close to failure, RIR of, 2 on average. That's a pretty true statement across the board. But as you start to try to apply that to individual context, the context is going to determine the utility of that information. So there's a difference between truth and utility, because information is only useful when it actually moves the needle in practice towards the goal. So I think a lot of the time people don't look at information for utility. They look at it for a factual correctness. And, with enough sort of, effort, you can make anything seem factually correct. And that's where we have a very hard time as human beings, knowing our cognitive blind spots and being able to discern objective truth from subjective truths. Obviously, that's what the scientific method is for. But at the end of the day, I guess what has helped me is learning about all of those things that I've just previously mentioned, and then trying to seek out good information from both direct and indirect sources. So obviously reading the literature, knowing how to understand the research if that's something that you want to do, but then also learning from people who are good at interpreting the literature, such as people we've had on this podcast, Eric Helms, Dr. Mike, guys like Brian Miner, James Krieger, Brad Schoenfeld, who can be like the mouthpiece for you to say, hey, this is my interpretation of the research. And usually over time, these experts are, going to be pretty reliable because they have a big audience. People are obviously going to criticize them if they put out bad information. They want to avoid that for their own needs. And then you try to synthesize all of that within a framework of what you obviously need to know, and then what is useful to you when you're going away and writing a program or you're in the gym training, and you do your best to make sure that, like I said earlier, it's like the knowledge that you're acquiring is not only factually correct, but of also great utility so that you can improve and make some gains. I hope I answered the question. I'm not sure if I did, but it's a very long process, and just being able to critically appraise information goes a long way, and constantly reflecting, self-evaluating, so that you're never satisfied or content with what you do know. I think it's quite an uncomfortable place, but you always have to be in this state of tension, trying to challenge what you do know, and continually be at peace, I guess, with that cognitive tension, which is, juxtaposition in and of itself. But I think that's something that's definitely worth thinking about if you're somebody who wants to get better at thinking and processing all of the information that's available online, because it can be confusing, and that's where you need to learn to think for yourself, not subscribe to groupthink. You don't want to just echo the thoughts and ideas of somebody else and parrot what they say, because remember, it's like everybody only sees what they see. And I think that's where having a number of different sources of information who potentially conflicting with one another can be very useful, just as I feel I'm sort of in the middle of Eric and Mike, who have, for the most part, agreements on most of the nuts and bolts of hypertrophy training. And anyone who says otherwise really doesn't listen to what they say. But there are some minor points of difference, and I think that's where I've been pretty good at not just jumping into one camp and saying, okay, I can see what Mike's saying about this, I can see what Eric's saying, but what do I think? What makes sense to me? And then obviously having the confidence, sometimes you do have to have confidence to be able to step out of a camp and say, hey, I'm not going to just jump into one of these camps and do as they say. I'm really going to try to forge my own path here, and not just become a parrot that recites and regurgitates everything that's said by other people. And although that's hard, because most things that we say as practitioners are generally things that we've seen, read, or heard, so there's nothing novel that comes out of our mouths. So in fact, we are parrots for the most part, but at the same time, it's like over the course of your career and this journey of self-discovery at like an intellectual level, I guess, and as a practitioner, you want to be able to have your own voice, your own way of doing things. And like we've discussed in previous episodes, you want to understand the theory and the principles so that you can devise your own methods. Because essentially what most of the disagreements between many practitioners in hypertrophy is about the application of theories and principles. Or some people think that one party's misinterpreting something, or so on and so forth. But again, it's comes down to being able to unpack all of that information without blindly following someone. And I think that happens over time. It's very difficult to be able to do that when you don't know anything, when you haven't learned, and you're not confident or competent in what you do. But I feel an area that I have been working on as a practitioner and somebody who's interested in the science of fitness is to not jump into somebody else's position and just blindly follow them, but to be able to think for myself where possible, anyway,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
obviously I don't know everything, and sometimes I do have to just listen and take what other people say is true, because I don't have the time, energy, or resources to go and investigate that for myself. But for things that I want to be within my wheelhouse, and knowing your wheelhouse is important, because you can't have multiple different wheelhouses if you want to be really, really good. It's like you got to either have breadth or depth. And as a practitioner, you generally want to go for breadth, because you have to deal with so many things. You know, as a coach, you have to work with nutrition, psychology, hypertrophy, strength, biomechanics, injury, like rehabilitation. You have to have like breadth of knowledge to be able to do all of these things pretty well. But then over time, you obviously find an area that interests you, it excites you, and you can start to go for depth. And you go down that, and that's what becomes your wheelhouse. And hopefully when you have your wheelhouse, that's when you can have your own opinion, I guess, and become a little bit more of an authority. But if you're not at the point where you're getting deeper and deeper in terms of your level of understanding of a given topic, you will need to rely on other sources, for information. And that's where, again, being able to discern good quality information that is more likely to be true than that which is not becomes imperative.
Yeah, I definitely relate to a lot of those points. Like in particular, I have two points I want to make. Firstly, I definitely relate to the idea of like this is probably what I'm struggling with recently, or is figuring out, making sure I don't, like, for instance, Eric, I would say, is a mentor to me. I don't want to get too much like, oh, I'm just going to agree with everything he says, but then again, I can see him being very correct, obviously, in a lot of ways. So I'm definitely I'm trying to sort of bridge that gap between the two, and sort of be cautious with being too gung-ho and being like, yeah, he must be right on this, and trying to be as skeptical as I can be. Secondly, as a practitioner, do you personally feel like you've aimed for sort of breadth first and then depth?
This is all like post hoc justification of how to go about your career. So yes, I definitely over the years acquired a lot more breadth, and now I feel like my interests have become very, very specific to hypertrophy and sports psychology. So, like we were talking about with Cliff on last episode, I joined you. We talk about like self-efficacy theory and things like that, which is not necessarily sports psychology, but a part of psychology that relates to sport. So those kind of things, coupled with nutrition for hypertrophy and performance. So it's a lot more specific now. Whereas years ago, I was learning about biomechanics. I was learning about injury management. I was learning about strength training specifically. I was learning about athletic development. I was learning about like nutrition for health and a number of different other things like endocrine system and and I got a little bit of knowledge about all of those things, enough to sort of arm me with the know-how to operate a discussion. And I think you always want to be able to draw back to first principles and understand the big rocks of things like biology, the social sciences, a lot of the key principles within a lot of those scientific domains that then relate to exercise and nutritional sciences, because that will again help you sort of navigate through information, because when stuff doesn't align with the principles, that it's pretty questionable from there. But yeah, certainly the early years of my career, I was a jack of all trades, master of none. I still feel as though I am that way, but I guess if you were to look at my specific sort of demographic, personal trainers, coaches, or whatever, I guess my knowledge in two areas, such as sports psychology and sports performance nutrition, and probably hypertrophy, it's like those 2 to 3 areas, whatever you call it, is probably a lot more advanced than most others. But then there's so many other areas where I would be way down in terms of my level of advancement with other topics and domains. So it was breadth first, and now I'm pushing for a bit of depth and hopefully get there. I think I'm getting a better handle on those things, and hopefully in a position where I can now do what I'm doing, which is share information that is not necessarily novel, but presented in a way that helps people understand it without having to read slabs and slabs of text. That's what you were referring to, that whole, RIR and different RPEs for the compoundedness of an exercise. It's like being able to create a visual representation that sort of explains, potentially an entire article is not easy. And I take a lot of time, and I spent many hours trying to, fine tune some of the graphics that I put together on JPS Education and in my seminar presentations. But that's sort of the role I want to take now, is to be able to bridge that gap from the research and in practice to the coaches who don't have time to necessarily go and sift through all the papers that one would potentially read for, understanding volume for hypertrophy, for example, but to be able to then express that visually in a schematic or graphical representation of what I've interpreted to be true and the best way to go about it in practice.
And then, I think in terms of I think I'm still in the stage of definitely still in the stage of getting the breadth. This is why I'm doing the JPS mentorship. So,
Cheeky plug. Thank you, James.
No worries. And then one thing that I sort of wanted to touch on next is I spoke to Aaron, and then Aaron introduced me to this concept of the neurobiological backdrop. We'll explain what that is in a second, or I guess you will, in some way. And then, but for me, it seems as though that is quite a pivotal idea when it comes to programming for hypertrophy, if we are aiming for quote unquote optimal. I personally feel as though that might be one of the main factors. Like, for instance, if you have shite recovery in total, you don't treat yourself like an athlete whatsoever. Are you the kind of person who needs to be deloading every 6 weeks? Like those kind of questions then come into play. Or for instance, the current debate between Mike and Eric, it's like, does this problem potentially impact that? I have a feeling that it might, but I don't think I know enough yet to know, obviously, or I don't think we can really know. But would you be able to explain that and then somewhat touch on, and then we can retouch on what I just talked about there?
Yes. So, firstly, I will admit that term is not my own. It's actually something that I got from John Kiley, who's a researcher. He's done quite a bit of research on periodization and understanding stress in terms of resistance training or sports, exercise science. So he's basically a researcher from the University of Central Lancashire in the UK. And there was a paper that he published, I think back in 2016, titled A New Understanding of Stress and the Implications for Our Cultural Training Paradigm, where he basically talks about how training as a stress is not as simply applied as what we think, and that training, adaptation, and recovery are very individualized and heavily modulated by background emotional settings. So that's the neurobiological backdrop that we speak of. It's like, what is the context of this individual who we're then dropping stress onto? Like, what is that, the backdrop of their, physiological, psychological, and emotional state that we're then imposing this stressor in? So we obviously know that physical training recovery is not purely a physiological phenomenon. And he talks about optimal training recovery strategies should blend like physical and emotional elements and challenge the previous sort of proactive model and thinking of applying progressive overload, training planning, and all those sorts of things, where you would have, for example, a 5-6 week training cycle. You have your intro week, and then you have 4 overloading weeks, deload. And you have planned progression at each week, and you just have everything mapped out proactively ahead of time. So his paper was a seminal work in this area, because it started to challenge the idea that overload should be applied in this way. And this, I think, is what has led Brian Miner and Eric and a number of other people to start to interpret overload in the way that they do, which is that it should be applied based on adaptations to prior stresses. So essentially, we're increasing the training stress as our performance gets better. Because as we get better, we need to train better. So overload happens organically and shouldn't be something that we try to chase. It happens, and we need to then overload the training as it happens, where we would have a more reactive approach to training. And that ties us into Kylie's work and his thoughts on the neurobiological backdrop, where that fluctuates wildly from day to day, week to week. In most individuals, very rarely do you have an athlete who is, going to be, sleeping the same amount of hours every night, having the same levels of stress, the exact same nutrition, the exact same, like psychological state. Like, it's going to change, and we need to be adaptive with the training plan. And that's where auto-regulation comes in, which is basically just respecting the principle of individualization in the training plan. And that's how we respect unique changes and individual differences in somebody's neurobiological state is via auto-regulation, the principle of individualization. And then if we look to the method of how we do that, we simply just adapt the training plan based on the readiness of the trainee at a given session. And this is obviously tricky to do because it requires not only knowledge on the coach's part, but also on the athlete's part. They need to know how to use the tool. It's like giving somebody a hammer and they don't know what to do with the hammer. It's like you can program an RPE 8 or give somebody a set range, or say they've got flexible exercise selection and we could do biceps of choice. But if they don't know what fucking 4 bicep exercises are, right, and they've only ever done a dumbbell curl, then you'll be like, what do you mean choice? I just do dumbbell curls. And if they don't know what RPE 8 is, or how to navigate, changes in their performance, even though they might understand RPE 8, but they don't realize that if they have a bad day, that RPE 8 might just mean that they've got to lift a lower load because their readiness to train is a little bit lower. Their fatigue might be higher, and they might have seen the increases in fitness and the adaptations at the expected rate. Therefore, they can't increase the load as expected or as they would like. They might still get emotionally stressed out about that, which can have downstream effects on, their subsequent sets for that exercise and the entire workout, the training week. That can stress them out emotionally because they underperformed based on their expectations going in, and all of a sudden that heightened level of stress changes their entire physiological state, and their next few sessions really suck and they're wondering what the fuck's going on. So again, it's like these things are useful to know, but we need to know how to apply them, how to teach the person applying them, how to use them, and have that very healthy sort of relationship from the coach and the athlete to be able to communicate what's happening in the plan, why the plan is the way that it is, and what to do with the plan and how to execute it, and then how to report and communicate that information back. And this is something that is, I think, becoming a bit of a lost art in coaching in the evidence-based practice communities. A lot of people are very much focused on the quantitative, objective data. They're looking at, stress index scores, RPEs, velocity, and all these sorts of things, which is great. It's fantastic. But at the same time, what about the emotional state of the athlete? That impacts the velocity, the RPE. That impacts all of those, objective markers that we're looking at to provide feedback. So we need to obviously consider that, and we need to factor that in and realize that outcomes will impact the psychological and emotional state of the athlete, which influences the physiological state and their adaptations, recovery, all those sorts of things. And then it feeds back into the outcomes, which impacts, it's a bit of a triad. That's a cool graphic I just thought of then, James. So there you go. That's how these things usually
I'll bleep that
come
bit
about.
out so people don't
Cut that out because otherwise somebody will steal my idea.
So one, I've been hearing a lot of Kylie's work recently, which is fascinating to hear that's interesting to get a little bit more background on that. I'll be reading his article straight after this podcast, I assume.
Yes, man. One of my favorite articles.
And it, as you sort of said, like, it does seem as though this is one of those things that is very hard to, this is probably one of those things that I would guess requires a lot more experience rather than just people hate on textbook education, but I think you would need a lot more experience. I think you need experience probably to do this, but also I guess that qualitative, like asking your client questions of how they feel, etc. Like today I put a thing on my story basically asking how you can gauge motivation to train, and I was looking for some like quantitative measure, but
Yeah, I saw that.
someone replied and they were
Question.
just like, yeah, they were just like, ask your athlete how much do they want to train hard, and it's like, oh, it's pretty simple and it's pretty probably accurate, I would say.
Yeah. Sometimes just, yeah, getting that feedback, man. Like, you don't necessarily need a scale, an index, or, you know, freaking scientifically tested and proven, um, you know, means of gathering data.
Mm.
It's like the athlete is the data. Everything
Yeah.
they say and do is data, whether it's qualitative, quantitative. There is data to be had from that. And sometimes you can quantify it. Sometimes you can create neat little systems around measuring and collecting that data. But sometimes it's just got to be intuitive. And that's where the coaching process can't always be explained or expressed in words, and we can't always articulate what we think. Like, a lot of it operates in the background, at almost like a subconscious level. Like, we can't be aware of every single bit of information that we process at any given point in time. And that's why, like I said earlier, like a lot of my sort of, I guess, theories or things that I've come to know have been sort of post hoc realizations of what I've done upon reflecting as to what worked in the past and what didn't work, and trying to just critically evaluate myself through this journey of personal discovery. It's we've got to reflect and critique ourselves, because that's when you'll generally start to pick up on your blind spots. You'll start to see your limitations, your biases, and all those sorts of things. And if you just go full steam ahead and you never stop to think back and evaluate your performance, I think you're going to leave a lot of chips on the table.
And I think
it could potentially be.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently, I had a good discussion with I forgot his first name. I'm not going to say his name, but someone from Data Driven Strength. We were having a good discussion around data in general, and sort of the idea that I think in powerlifting, it seems as though you can use quantitative data a lot more, but it seems though in bodybuilding or hypertrophy training or physique or whatever you want to call it, it seems though it's a lot more, as you're sort of describing, like psychology is a lot more at the forefront, I think, and a lot more of it is qualitative, like, oh, I just feel terrible recently, or X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, and I just want to say one thing on that. Like, a lot of the time, the psychological stuff becomes more important with individuals who have greater psychological variation or needs. Like, some athletes, most athletes generally are great athletes because their psychology doesn't limit their ability to do the things they need to do to be the best that they can be. That's why they're the best. But we're generally not working with the best of the best. Like Cliff Wilson, doesn't have spreadsheets and, have these fancy ways of collecting data, because he's working with the best of the best. So if he gives him a plan, all he needs to know is, did you follow the plan? Good. Send me photos, whatever. It's like, that's fine at that point. But it's like when you're working with anything below that, you're starting to work with people where the psychology and their mental state and emotional state starts to play into their physiological state a lot more, which is where you need to pay a lot more attention to that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I've really noticed that when I compare the clients that I've got from sort of people that know me in real life, like real life, whatever you call it, and then like
the real world, not Instagram,
not Instagram and podcast world. But then compare that to the clients that I usually get through the podcast or stuff like that. It's like those clients are usually very, very informed, and they're a lot more sort of, they treat themselves like athletes and all that. And then the ones that I find in sort of the real world, the psychology is a little bit more. They're a little bit more sort of less educated around the stuff, and sort of it's definitely more of a battle with adherence, I think, quite commonly. I think pretty obviously the discretion is probably from the interest or education difference. In terms of neurobiological backdrop, is there like when programming for that is like how can you take that into account? Like how can you take the neurobiological backdrop into account? I guess it's probably a very hard question to answer on a podcast because you probably need like individual examples.
Yeah.
But how would you like what would be an example of a situation where you would change the programming due to that?
Yeah, so that's where you have to obviously gather information from the client in terms of their emotional state, so how they're feeling, their stress levels, all of those sorts of things, and generally just a conversation. You can gather that kind of stuff. And this is where working with people online in person, it's a completely different kettle of fish. I can see when somebody walks into the gym and they look, drained, tired, emotionally stressed, feeling like crap. And right then and there, this person is not going to be able to perform at the level that they normally would, and you need to adjust something somewhere. And you're just trying to get that same sort of information online. This is where having, video calls, weekly check-ins, where, my clients answer questions about, how they're feeling, their mood state. They just, put a little description outlining everything that's going on in their life. And, then when I'm working with them online, because I don't get that real-time feedback, there's a bit of lag between when I can pick up on those sorts of things, because we don't want to just change it because they've said in an email, they're feeling a little bit down today. It's like, well, how down? Like how well do I know this person to know whether or not them telling me they're down means that they're just having a shitty day, or that, holy crap, this person, is on the brink of freaking emotional, breakdown, right? It's like when you get to know a person, if I say that I'm not feeling too good, mentally, people will generally stop and go, fuck, dude, are you all right? Because I'm the kind of guy who just go out and say, hey, I'm feeling a bit sad today. But some people, they're a little bit more inclined to talk about their emotions, which is fine. So when they say that they're feeling down, it's like, hey, you take it with a grain of salt. It's like, come on, you'll be okay. And it won't really affect their physiological state, right? And that's where you need to know your clients, and you need to just have some simple measures within your coaching systems to have check-ins, to get that qualitative data each week, looking at their training performance, their recovery, soreness, sleep, things like that, just the basics that most people would have in a spreadsheet. Then you do video calls. But in terms of like when to adjust the program, you need to understand that online coaching, there is always going to be that lag time. And that's where you've got to teach the athlete. You've got to teach them how to regulate themselves, number one, because you don't want to teach them first, if you're not feeling well, change the program. You want to teach them first, if you're not feeling great emotionally, or whatever the case may be, in terms of this neurobiological backdrop, the word that you love, word of the day. John Kiley will be, clapping and singing.
Sure, he'll be loving listening to this.
You should first teach them how to regulate that so that they can improve their situation. And then if that fails and they can't, for whatever reason, they should obviously continue to try to improve their situation and regulate their emotions. But that's when it's, if they can't at that point in time where it's now affecting their training, you have to teach them how to adjust their training, to make sure that they are imposing a stimulus within the threshold of what is required for overload, but also their tolerance at any given point in time. I hope I answered the question.
Okay, no, I think that makes sense. In terms of like specifically variables, what kind of, say if you know that someone's had like stress has just gone up all of a sudden and you're 2 weeks into a mesocycle, how do you go about adjusting that in terms of variables?
Yeah, if they're 2 weeks into a mesocycle, I wouldn't change anything unless it absolutely was required and they were just not, recovering. That it looked as if they were going to be in that situation for quite a while moving forward, and then I would adjust things. But I think the changes that I make are always dependent on the seriousness and the requirements of somebody's goals. So if I have a Gen Pop athlete who's in a fat loss phase and they have a really crappy day, and they're training, they're just not motivated, they're feeling like crap, they're not performing well, is it really going to ruin their gains and progress if they cut out a few exercises and do 1 or 2 sets less on a few other exercises? Definitely not. Just getting the workout in could in fact be better than nothing. And it might help keep them on track with their nutrition. And it could definitely go a long way in elevating their mood and hopefully helping them feel as if, hey, well, I thought I couldn't train, I didn't think I was going to have a good session, but I actually did it. And you build a little bit of competency, because we know they want to set tasks that are challenging, but not so challenging that people can't do it. And I think in those kind of situations, sometimes if the context of the individual calls for a light or easy session, that's essentially what we're doing here, just getting them to do something is better than nothing. However, if I have somebody who's close to a powerlifting meet and they're 2 weeks out and they've got to get their sessions in, unless they absolutely can't, we're not going to modify too much. Yes, we can adjust load within the parameters of what we've set, but the parameters are going to be a lot closer and more narrow for somebody who's very advanced versus somebody who's a beginner that is looking for some outcomes that are indirectly influenced by their training, such as fat loss, right? If somebody's primary goals are directly related to training, well that narrows the bandwidth of the parameters, right? And we have less wiggle room if they're serious. And then again, their level of seriousness narrows things further, right? So obviously there's going to be times when we need to call an audible, extreme life circumstances that just make training as per the plan near impossible or just counterproductive. But in most cases, I think, like I said, the goal of the individual as well as their level of seriousness determines the how broad or narrow the bandwidth of parameters will be, and you move within those parameters and adjust things accordingly. And hopefully, like I said, you can pick those things up through your coaching systems, but you obviously have to be looking to teach your clients and athletes, number one, how to regulate themselves so that they can stay within the parameters of the program. That encompasses not only emotional regulation, but also nutrition, recovery, sleep, all the lifestyle factors, psychology, self-belief, all of those things, and then obviously executing the program. And then you need to teach them after that how to adapt the program within those parameters and use the tools that you're using as part of your coaching systems and methods, whether it's using RPE, which is under the umbrella of auto-regulation, whether it's using exercise of choice, so flexible exercise selection, flexible workout schedules, flexible set ranges, whatever the case may be. You need to teach them how to use that accordingly.
Yeah, I think that these are things that I am doing my best to learn as I go along, but I think it's the kind of thing that I will improve with experience, I think, a lot of the time.
Man, definitely.
Knowing how big of an adjustment to make.
Yeah, so and look, if you're uncertain, it's like a small adjustment is generally going to be better than a large adjustment. But the magnitude of change that you make to a program, is always going to be dependent on, what you're trying to achieve and what situation you're facing.
Yes, completely. So, and then I kind of wanted to go into, I guess you would say general sort of hypertrophy programming. I believe you're co-authoring a paper that is coming out soon with Helms and
the rumors are true.
Dr. Miner.
This non-scientist is going to be published in a scientific journal.
I'm very, very excited to read it. I'll probably be the first reader. Very, very, very excited. As I think I've made that abundantly clear. But in terms of this, so there's a few things I want to touch on. There's two things in particular. So in particular, firstly, how do you personally, I'll outline both the questions first and then we'll dive into the first. So First question is sort of around how basically progression over a single mesocycle, how you generally like to line that up. But then also, I think there's the context of the whole macrocycle. So let's say, however long that is, say if it's a block of 4 mesocycles or something like that. How do you personally feel as though for a hypertrophy focused athlete, and even you could feel free to give examples or whatever, how do you go about programming that when you think about the individual mesocycle? So we'll go into that, but then also that mesocycle and taking that in the context of the macrocycle. Because when, for instance, why I think this is quite a fascinating sort of discussion is I think for me, it seems as though it is a key part of the disagreement between the current disagreement. But also I do think when looking at powerlifting program, it seems as though the macrocycle component of it seems to be a lot more important for them. But for me, that seems to, at least from what I think, the issue of the macrocycle being important, or the relative importance of the previous mesocycles, relies a little bit on adaptation to how much volume you need, I guess. However, would you be able to sort of outline, well, first of all, do you have any comments on that, but also how would you go about setting up a mesocycle for hypertrophy? And obviously there will be ranges and all that.
Yeah, no, you touched on a lot of really important points there. And I think, firstly, when it comes to the macro cycle, planning out long-term for hypertrophy, the research isn't necessarily supporting periodization theory, which is basically planning and organizing training, which is what we do in the time scale of a macro cycle. We're just planning the long term. A lot of the research doesn't actually show that for hypertrophy there's any real benefit to periodization. However, there's limitations to the research. Usually most of the studies are very short, so they're not actually a macro cycle and all these sorts of things. But I did a podcast with Eric Helms and Dr. Mike, funnily enough, on this topic of programming versus periodization. I think it's one of our most popular podcasts with like 60, 70,000 views. Anyway,
I think I listened to it like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, that's a really, really good podcast. So I think when it comes to hypertrophy training, periodization is important, because if you want to achieve any goal or anything noteworthy, you need to plan and organize. I think if you apply the tenets of periodization correctly, as opposed to taking the methods and systems of periodization theory, such as pre-planned progression and reverse linear and non-linear. If you just look at the fundamental tenets of goal setting, planning, organizing, respecting the individual, including variation, and having some form of progression that targets the specific adaptations that the goal that the individual requires. If you look to those fundamental tenets, I think that it is very hard to find a case that periodization theory doesn't have utility for hypertrophy. So when it comes to planning the macro cycle, I think this is only something that can really be done with very serious trainees. So I talk about late intermediates and advanced athletes, and especially physique competitors and powerlifters. For the general population, beginners, it's just not feasible. As a coach, you probably want to have a well-established relationship with the person that you're programming and planning for, because if you know that they're going to be around for 2 years, you can plan a year in advance and it's no big deal. But if you don't know whether or not they're going to be here in 6 weeks' time, then I think that the opportunity cost might not be worth it. So that's some important considerations. But I do think planning a macro cycle is beneficial if you're advanced, very serious about your training. And in terms of how we do that, we obviously break the macro cycle up into blocks, which are usually 2 to 3 mesocycles, and we have a goal for those blocks of training. Do we want to build muscle? Is it a maintenance phase? Is it a strength cycle? Is it a strength block? Whatever the case may be. And you go from there into your mesocycles, and then you plan out your individual mesocycles in terms of what is our method of overload going to be based on that overarching objective. If it's hypertrophy, we're obviously looking to achieve, a tension stimulus. If it's strength, we want to obviously, see increases in load, technical proficiency, mastery of the lift that you want to be strong at. If it's a fat loss phase, obviously we want to see, the scale weight changes and all these sorts of things. So it's like that midterm planning, right? Then you go into your microcycles from there. And that's where you plan the individual sessions, how they're sequenced together, and you order them in a way that is generally within the time frame of a week or thereabouts, and what you're going to target in those workouts, whether it's a specific muscle group, what exercise you'll use, your sets, your reps, your loading ranges, your intensity thresholds, so RIR, RPE, and then you have to think about, as a coach anyhow, how you then communicate that to your athletes and you deliver the program. And I think that's a lost art as well, but I think a lot of people do really, really well also. And that's how you go about it. But in terms of how I design a hypertrophy cycle, we need to look to the training variables after we've looked at the principles. So the principles being, we want to achieve a tension stimulus, like I said, and that's going to be this sort of elusive range of, no adaptation, atrophy, to, increases in muscle size, so hypertrophy, to maladaptation, so plateau, regression. It's that, non-linear, inverted, U-shaped response we see with the volume literature. Like that's basically a summary of like the tension stimulus. It looks like that. It's like you do more training and you do harder training, like you get more adaptation to a point before you start to plateau, regress, and potentially lose your gains. So you're trying to find that range for the individual. And to do that, you look to their historical data, right? So you look to, what have they done previously? And that will start to tell you whether they're a beginner, intermediate, advanced, what their training the individual needs are in terms of like the training targets and fitness qualities that we're trying to achieve within the context of this mesocycle and macrocycle. But then it's setting the volume parameters, intensity thresholds, ticking the frequency box, and that's just how we organize, volume and intensity. Then you look to what exercise you're going to select and, direct that volume and intensities to. Then you look to the order of the exercises, rest, tempo. You just work through Eric Helm's muscle strength pyramid, basically from the bottom up, making sure that it's enjoyable, sustainable, and realistic, and they can adhere to it long term. You think about what progression models you're going to put in place. Are you going to prescribe? This is all sort of the X's and O's of coaching. Essentially, it's like, are you going to give rep ranges? Are you going to give a single rep target? Right? It's like, I don't like giving anyone except beginners who have never trained before a single rep target, because I know that I can't be certain that is the exact stimulus that is going to produce hypertrophic adaptations, because that's just garbage. Anyone who says that 1 week you're going to do 12 for your 3 sets of squats, and then the next week you do all sets of 13 at the same RIR. It's like, I don't know about that. It's like, what if you could do 20 reps the next week because you're feeling bloody great? It just means you've undershot your intensity thresholds massively. So I usually give a range, and I teach my athletes how to use that range and incorporate Brian Miner's method of dynamic double progression, where we're looking to progress reps and load to meet an RPE, but we do it in a very auto-regulated, reactive fashion. So provided you're within the rep range, provided you do the sets that are prescribed, you're within the rep range at the target RPE. It really doesn't matter what weight you use, because we know through the literature that loading zones are less important for hypertrophy. It's all about proximity to failure and or getting some heavy weight on the bar, over 80% thereabouts of 1 rep max. So getting people to the RPE is basically the goal within the rep range. So I have that as my metric for measuring their progress, because if overload's occurring, then we should see performance improve, because that is what we measure increases in fitness as in terms of hypertrophy in the context of the training plan. Because a bigger muscle is a stronger muscle relative to its size. So if they're growing, they can produce more force, which means that they can lift more weight or perform the same weight for more reps at the same RPE. So That's my sort of approach. We obviously apply auto-regulation and individualize the plan as we go based on check-ins and things like that. I'm very much a fan of reactively taking deloads as opposed to pre-planned deloads, unless I have like athletes in contest prep or strength athletes who are in a powerlifting preparation phase. Because if somebody's recovering, kicking ass in a training program, they've got a deload next week, why stop? Unless they have some schedule limitations that call for the deload, it's like, why not get another week of really good training in? Like, why?
It's like that's the point of the mesocycle where it's like, okay, everything's going really, really well. Let's just stop. Well,
yeah, the work rest paradigm, or like the overload to deload paradigm of like 4-to-1 or 5-to-1, man, that's just like just disrespecting individual like responses to training, right? It's like if somebody's at the 5th week and they're recovering just fine, they're improving their performance and they're feeling great, and you deload, you have done that person a disservice because you've just wasted a fucking week of their life.
I love how you said disrespecting there.
You are.
I agree.
Because that's not auto-regulation. That is not taking into account the individual's response to the training plan. It is. It fucking flat out is. You can quote me on that, James.
You said that last time.
So yeah, that's how I usually program. It's like we'll have an intro week with sort of 80, 75, 80-ish% of the volumes that I want to have, baseline volumes in week 1. Then we move volume up in week 1.
Would that be, just to confirm, would that be set volume?
Set volume, correct.
Yeah.
And as Eric has said, like I think, I really do agree with Eric on this. The volume is not just the number of sets we perform, it is volume load. So, the amount of work that we're doing, the mechanical work that we're doing, which is what really has been shown, if you break it down to be, have a dose-response relationship with hypertrophy, right? It's mechanical work. And mechanical work is our volume load. So not just the number of sets we perform, but also taking into account, the tonnage and whatnot. So I think, if you keep sets relatively constant, sometimes I will sprinkle in, and this is where I diverge from Eric and Brian, just having, a set volume for an entire cycle and, auto-regulating things. Like sometimes I will, add in sets and progress sets. Not proactively necessarily, but I'll think about it towards the back end of a mesocycle for maybe some side delts, some biceps, some triceps, because it gets buy-in from the client and they enjoy it. If they are recovering and they have time to do it, then I don't see why that's necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't hurt if it's before a deload. Again, this is where I don't have any science to prove that this is an effective method, but fuck, my clients seem to like it. Gets them coming back for more. What I do know is when someone enjoys their training and is willing to train hard and find something useful and they buy into it, and that makes them train harder and they stay with you for longer and train for longer. I know that gets somebody bigger. Yeah. So am I willing to sometimes step out from I guess the certainty of the science and go on a limb to do something that is maybe pseudo-scientific or bro science? Knowing that it's what's going to help in the long term, you fucking betcha I will. And that's where I think being a practitioner, you have to be willing to step in and try to bridge the gap sometimes and experiment. That's what I've done a lot of the last few years. I've tried to experiment with different things. Still don't really know if it fucking works because nobody will. We're a good few years off, or a good decade or two, I think, of having a really strong understanding of like mesocycle progressions for hypertrophy and all these sorts of things. But hey, we're getting the conversation started. Things are moving in a very positive direction. I think people are interested, and that's all good stuff for science and those in the trenches.
Yeah, I actually do the exact same thing in terms of volume progression. Not all the time, but pretty similar. Isolations and things like that cause low fatigue. I will increase it sometimes at the end of the mesocycle or close to.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that that's a silly thing to do, provided you know that it's not, necessarily supported by literature, or that it's not something that is going to produce an adaptation. You're doing it for other reasons, such as buying and enjoyment, and to keep the client, interested and feeling as though, they're getting something out of their training. Like I think they're very valid reasons to make a decision in the coaching process. And I don't think that it's necessarily evidence-based to frown upon that kind of decision, because if we look at what evidence-based practice is, it's scientific literature, coach's experience, and the individual needs. So, if the evidence-based community is just standing on the pillar of science and not respecting the individual and the coach's experience, well, I dare say it's not evidence-based.
Yeah, then it's, I guess, science-based practice,
Correct.
which is flawed. One thing that I want to lay out as well with macrocycles, for instance, I don't want to sell your program on air. I mean, I don't mean that. I mean, I don't want to give away your program on air, but your arm specialization thing, maybe we can use that as a basis for this. Do you think there could be a rationale for increasing volume over say, for instance, for a specialization phase? Let's say you've got arm specialization phase. You want to get big arms. You've got 3 mesocycles to do it. Do you think it could be a good idea to increase volume over those 3 mesocycles, whether you do that through volume load or volume sets? I would likely say both.
Yeah, I think it's just easier to measure volume in terms of number of sets. Provided somebody doesn't get stupidly strong like in that period of time. Do you know what I mean? Like if you have somebody who's on a very shitty program, crappy technique, and not really training hard or well at all, and then you get them on a good program, they start training hard, and it's like they get really, really strong. It's like, well, maybe measuring volume at that point, because there's been such a large relative increase in the absolute load that they're lifting, right? Their volume load is going to shoot up, right? So progressing sets at that point is only going to freaking increase volume load even further.
Yeah.
But at the level where somebody's making really small and minor sort of increases from mesocycle to mesocycle, which is the best way to measure hypertrophy outcomes, is not necessarily week to week. It's mesocycle to mesocycle on a lift. Did your repetition strength in the moderate to high repetition ranges for that exercise at the same RPE improve with similar training volumes for that muscle group, right? Because otherwise you're just tapering at that point. If you're, say, for example, squatting, and I've done this in the past where I'm like, well, I must be growing, but I knew I wasn't, I had that initial thought. I was doing like sets of 215 for 4 sets of 5 on the squat, and I was like, holy cow, like my best in my hypertrophy cycles is like, 185, 190, for sets of like 5. And I thought about it, and I was like, well, I'm low bar squatting now, 1. 2, I'm squatting twice a week, and that's the only leg movement I'm doing. I'm doing about 8 to 10 sets a week for my quads, where previously I was doing around 8 to 10 sets for my quads per session. So my fatigue was a lot higher. So in that, squatting cycle where I did 215 for 5s, 4 sets of 5, my fatigue was a lot lower, and I was just able to express my fitness adaptations a lot better, right? Because fitness fatigue model, right? My fitness minus my fatigue is my level of performance. So that's why when you're measuring your performance, you're using training proxies to assess whether or not you're building muscle. You're probably not going to see much change within a mesocycle. You're better off comparing mesocycle to mesocycle, or just looking at your strength, repetition strength for a certain rep range on that exercise over time. Say, for example, the bench press, right? With around, let's say, 10 to 12 sets of chest volume in 12 months' time, with a similar volume at a similar what's my RPE 8? 12 months ago to 12 months now, for 5 to 8 reps on the bench press. Oh wow, it's up 10 kilos. You most likely got them bigger, especially if you're getting into the intermediate levels and you've tapped out all of those neurological adaptations that the beginners get that allow them to see very rapid increases in their strength. But yes, I think mesocycle volume should go up in a specialization cycle because you are sort of down regulating volume from other muscle groups, right? Or you should be at least, to free up adaptive resources to go towards that targeted muscle group, meaning that you can push things a little bit more for that targeted muscle group, right? Especially for something like arms, where it's like, well, there's not going to have like a lot of systemic fatigue doing some bicep curls, you know what I mean? Like if you're bringing down your leg volume to free up, adaptive resources for your arms, well, crap, man, you might be able to push things a little bit more and more over the mesocycle. So what I like to do with specialization cycles is that first cycle, I will usually down-regulate volume for other muscle groups, and we'll keep the volume for the target muscle group pretty much the same. So it won't increase volume at that point. And we'll see if that extra adaptive resources start to see accelerated gains for that muscle group. Then after that mesocycle, if the person's recovering, adapting well, depending on how well they're adapting, I'll probably keep things the same. But when they're recovering, adaptation starts slow. We might not see improvements in performance or whatever. And I just think that they could do with more volume. Then we'll increase volume. And then we do the same thing in the third cycle, right? So if you look at the block, which is potentially 3 mesocycles for a specialization phase, 2 to 3 for really serious people. Volume is probably staying the same in the first cycle, goes up in the second, and then potentially in the third as well. But that's all auto-regulated. But I guess, on average, if you were to look at things, volume is volume load, and probably sets as well will go up somewhere. And that, how steep that curve is probably not very steep at all. Depending on how you measure volume, obviously, if it's sets, well, that's going to have a different curve to volume load. But in any case, you probably want to take the average, and it's going up either way.
Sweet. And then one thing that I've heard some people say, and I found it interesting, but I haven't seen any. Well, I can definitely see the logic behind it. I've employed it myself, actually. I think it's interesting. Do you think there's any not evidence, but do you think there's any value, or where do you see the value in increasing the rep range to increase volume load in a situation like that? Like, for instance, in the third mesocycle of the macrocycle, or the block for an arm specialization phase or something.
I think that's just applying the principle of variation, man. That's all it is. Sweet. Right? It's like we know that within the rep ranges of 5 to 30, you're going to produce some hypertrophy. They're probably the best rep ranges for muscle growth and the most economical, in terms of how we achieve the appropriate stimulus. And I think provided you stay within that rep range, having some variation from cycle to cycle can offset monotony and strain. We know through the research that that's what variation does. It reduces monotony and strain and can just keep somebody motivated. And I think provided that you stay within the parameters of what an exercise self-selects for a rep range to be effective and safe. Say, for example, the squat, provided you keep that between, say, 5 and 12 reps, you could do one cycle with, 5 to 8 reps. The next, cycle, you probably want to keep it the same. And then, the third cycle, you don't want to go below 5 reps again, because then you have to add more sets and all the rest of it. So you might go up to, 6 to 12 reps, for example. Like that's not a bad way to program. There's no right or wrong. I just think as long as you keep it logical and you stick to the principles and you understand what stimulus you're trying to achieve in training and how, that is best attained at a pragmatic level when you're writing the program, you're good,
Sweet. Cool. Many thoughts going through my head.
Well, that's good. Thought-provoking.
At least we know there's something in there. So just to confirm, you don't see it you don't personally use it as a method to deliberately increase volume load as a method to increase hypertrophy?
No, because we're trying to get the volume load is an outcome of a bigger muscle. It is not something that we need to induce or increase to build a bigger muscle. Does that make sense?
That's what I'm going to quote.
Yeah, you can quote that then.
Beautiful. Okay. Let me think.
You made me laugh.
I'm just looking at my notes. You did mention off air, and I might cut this bit out. You did mention off air that you wanted to ask me a question. Is that something?
What do you think of the programming discussion that's going on at the moment in terms of mesocycle progression? What are your thoughts? You've interviewed Eric, you've interviewed Mike, and you've been paying attention to our stuff, and you're across most of the information that comes out in this stuff. So, what do you think?
Both absolute idiots. Have no clue.
I like how much more confident you've become in a podcast host to call them both idiots. That's progress, man. That is a sign of overload in podcast hosting. It is.
Oh, definitely. My volume load has definitely increased over time.
It has.
Well, I every time I've been asked this, I've kind of said a similar thing where I've said, I don't think I know enough to know. However, my hunch is that you and Eric and co are more correct. However,
How do you know that we're more correct?
that's the thing. That's
Because that's the critical critical detail.
Yes.
That statement to validate your position, basically.
Mm.
It's like you need to know that we're correct.
To me, it seems
what information are you comparing that makes us more correct than, say, someone like Mike? Like, what is the?
Well, to me, the
where do the differences lie for you? I guess.
Well, for me, like, okay, there is the actual content of the article, which is one thing, which seems to be highly convincing to me when reading Eric's mass article, for instance. Obviously, I haven't read the response article to the letter to the editor, but when looking at all the content that's been put out, it seems as though personally for me, so I trust Mike quite heavily. I trust you quite a decent amount. And then I trust Eric quite heavily. So that's a joke. But the authority with which people seem to be putting out content seems to be different. Or the willingness to back their own statements, maybe.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Like, for instance, like math, like the one thing that sort of shot out to me a little bit, and no shots at Mike for this, but the article they released from the RP website was not referenced, and then the original article, obviously it was referenced, but I believe it was a review article, so I don't believe it wasn't. To me, like, I remember I emailed Eric back when that came out, and I was sort of, oh, what do you think of this? And we were discussing it a little bit. And I was sort of, I couldn't quite put my finger on why it seemed contentious or seemed not incongruent with what I understand of hypertrophy so far. And like the fact that the mass article is fully referenced, and then the fact that you guys are even going to the effort of putting together a response, to me indicates something. So I wish it was a critical appraisal of what's actually inside the articles that I've seen so far. I wish it was that, but it's unfortunately not. It's more a personality and
approach.
bias.
The approach, not necessarily the information. Okay,
yeah, unfortunately, yeah. I wish it was the information though, but I don't. And it's important to note my bias here, because it's like Eric will likely be a role in my educational future for a while. So it's like
you don't want to piss him off.
Well, yeah, I'm biased towards him in many ways. Like, he's one of the few people in the evidence-based community that I've actually met in real life, and that probably plays some role in my bias. Plus, I find it I haven't yet, and I find this frustrating. For instance, I had a conversation with Eric. My first conversation with him, I brought up Jordan Peterson, and he's interesting in many ways, but he opened me up to the idea of like, okay, you should be able to critique these people that you view as educational, and that's something I haven't yet been able to do with Eric, or at least to a significant degree, and I find that troubling. Not troubling, but I find that I wish I could, but I don't know where it is yet, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. Yeah, I think that's awesome. You're aware of that, man. I think very cool to see you. Thinking about your thinking. It's meta thinking.
Yeah,
it's great.
I'm trying my best. Thanks. I think that's largely been influenced by a lot of the people at JPS, because like for instance, I literally said on yesterday's story where I was like, wait, you just asked me why do you want to compete? And I was like, oh fuck, I don't know. I had absolutely no clue. So yeah,
that's always good to hear, man. But I think credit to you for putting in the work. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
Very true.
You can drown it, but you couldn't make it drink.
Very true.
Then you'd piss off a lot of vegans and animal rights activists. And that wouldn't be good. So
Yes.
you wanna make a drink, and you're drinking,
Yes.
which is you're a
Yes.
good horse. Say name.
Thank you. Do you have like for you? How set?
I've had enough of this conversation.
No. How set in stone are you now? After, well, I guess I don't know if the article's done or whatever, but how set in stone, or how, like, is there anything that could come out of the woodworks that would change your mind?
Of course.
Like what?
If I was to say that I wouldn't change my mind,
Like what would have to be presented?
Fool. I don't think that my mind is set at all. I think I'm quite pliable, and I'm open to adjusting my viewpoints based on better information coming out. What would change my mind? It depends what you're asking about. If you're asking about the way that we apply overload,
I guess
whether set increases are best for overload, it depends what the specific question that you're asking is.
Like, for instance, like a lot of the talk has been around proactive versus reactive set progression, and
it would take quite a bit of evidence for me to think that proactive overload is better than reactive auto-regulation style of overload.
Yeah.
And I think Mike even was singing a very different tune in his latest article about how he applies set progression, specifically how he auto-regulates, and then some of the examples he gave in terms of increasing the number of sets was very modest in comparison to his original letter to the editor, where sets increased in their example model from 10 to 20 across a mesocycle. So I think, it depends what kind of question is being asked, but in terms of proactive versus reactive overload, I definitely think reactive auto-regulating your overload is the way to go, and it would take quite a significant amount of evidence suggesting the otherwise is a better approach for me to change my opinion.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree. And also I think that's where because I've been thinking a lot recently around like, okay, how could we actually use quantitative data to change hypertrophy programming in a significant way? And I think it is negligible. I think it's like, for instance, if we tried to use volume load to predict things, or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just been something that's going through my mind, but I don't know if it has any. Yeah, but anyway, should we finish off here?
Yeah, man. Sounds good to me. I've really enjoyed this conversation, by the way.
Yeah. Did you have any closing thoughts or anything you wanted to restate or make clear before we finish?
No. I'm pretty happy with the discussion. I think, as always, you did a great job in moderating. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and an honor to be on the podcast yet again. So thank you.
My pleasure. And then where can people find you online?
Well, JPS Health and Fitness is our website, .com.au, because we are obviously from Australia. And then on Instagram, JPS Health_Fitness, JPS _Education. And they probably don't really want to follow me personally on social media. It's not all that great, just a bunch of dad jokes, banter. But if you want that kind of stuff, Jacob Schepis _JPS, SCHEPIS.
Yes, I would be highly surprised if a large majority of my listeners don't know JPS, as I've had the whole cast on, I think, nearly.
Yes, the whole cast. We're like a TV show. We're like we're a cast of characters down here in Australia.